Welcome to this episode of Expert Insights brought to you by DH Marketing. I'm Trent Hall, the head of growth, and I'm joined by Pascal, our CTO. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time here. This is an interesting topic, and I think it is probably one of the most important that we can really be talking about today. But, it's not always sometimes the most exciting thing. We're talking today about consent. So you might have launched your new campaign, the creative looks great, the offer is strong, the calls to action are clear, but once that send button rolls out, that spam complaint or unsubscribe might start rolling in. And often it's not a campaign problem. It's actually a trust problem. So nice to see you today, Pask, and looking forward to getting into this one with you.
Hi, Trent. Well, I'm certainly excited to jump into this topic. I think today we'll be unpacking how consent really works in the real world, why one email address is equal one person, which is where a lot of people fall down.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? I mean, I actually spent a bit of time, actually moved to Germany and was working in the consulting space over there when GDPR first came in. I think I moved there about 3 months before it happened, and it was one of the most insane experiences when it came to companies trying to conform to these new consent obligations that they had at the time. And we're seeing more and more of that stuff start to filter through in some case law in Australia, and ultimately it's going to start reading the books of our legislation. So when it comes to what you see as the biggest gap between how teams think about consent, what do you think shows up, especially in the customer experience?
That's a really good question. Firstly, I want to touch on what you just said before. A lot of people view it purely through a legal framework. And it's not just about what is the legal thing that you have to do so that you don't get in trouble. It's also about the customer experience. And obviously you have to do something that's legal, but also is it the right thing by the customer and does it make sense to the customer? If you have a complicated preference center, then you need to make sure you actually follow through on the promises that you've made. That's thing one. And a lot of people mix up preferences versus consent. And the second thing is it has to actually be meaningful to people. If you give people choices that don't matter, then they're just going to, think you're making fun of them. They're not going to like it. They are going to unsubscribe. They are going to say, you know what, it's easier to complain than it is to actually deal with the process that you've built for me. And so a lot of that conversation is around how do we make it as easy as possible for people to get what they want without annoying them, and understanding what is it that we're allowed to do, and also understanding the difference between this is what I want to do in terms of my activity versus here's who I'm going to choose should receive this activity, because actually it's not just about sending as much comms as possible to people, it's about sending the relevant comm and making sure that that lines up with both what they've consented to, but also what we think is interesting to them.
No, it's a really good point. I have almost daily the conversation with customers onboarding into some of the marketing tools that we provide services on here in DH. Having this conversation where the preference center is this nirvana. And in truth, it is actually a really useful tool to maintaining, people subscribe to, I guess, the communications that they want to receive. But so often they're overcomplicated and sometimes not handed over properly between maybe a changeover of staff. And that means customers, are going to get communications that are misaligned with their expectations. And when that occurs, consent becomes a real heads up in that conversation. So, I guess in that sense, you mentioned it doesn't necessarily end with a legal framework. Where do organizations think consent ends? But where does it actually keep going after that, you think?
That's a great question. So a lot of organizations think that as long as they've put up a web page somewhere that has some checkboxes, they've done what they need to do. And then they don't really worry about the rest. And that's obviously not right. Firstly, we need to make sure that there's a process that exists within the organization so that whatever consent is obtained is what you actually do when you're doing your activity. So if you're collecting consent about a specific program versus everything, then you need to actually make sure that you have a process that says, when I'm sending an email about this, I need to have it tied to the consent that was specifically obtained for that item. Not just go, oh, it's too hard, I'll just send it across everything. Because when we do that, we are actually ignoring the customer's preferences. And this is not legal advice. I'm not going to go down the legal side too much here, but people think that might actually be also against the actual Spam Act if we are breaking that. I've heard it both ways. I'm not going to comment on which way I think. However, from a customer perspective, the important thing here is that it's just surprising. You just don't know why you're getting comms sometimes, and that makes you not trust the brand. And so you'll just unsubscribe from everything, or maybe you'll hit the report a spam button just because you're not sure what's causing that and you don't want to deal with it. That's a key thing, right? The customer goes, I just don't want to deal with this. I've tried to unsubscribe before, it didn't work, I'm just going to report it as spam.
Yeah, it's really common that we start to see some of these things come through, right? Like ultimately, service providers like Gmail or Outlook are just giving more and more tools to the end consumers to be able to, create those spam complaints or create list unsubscribes a lot easier than having to dig through the footer of an email and find that unsubscribe button. So those technical, opt-outs are becoming more and more present. And I guess it's also on the vendor side to make sure that they can capture them and process them in a way that makes sense for their tools. Now, at the beginning of this conversation, you actually mentioned, I think you said why one email address doesn't equal one person. If you're anything like me, you've probably got a few email addresses, and they're not just the ones that you had from maybe high school back in the day. There may be multiple ones across, hobbies or organizations. So talk to me a little bit more about, we often designing consent around contact points and why that's an important consideration in the future.
Awesome. That's a great question. So again, not legal advice, but let's talk about that for a second. Generally speaking, in Australia, people will say that when you are consenting to be emailed, it's actually your email address that's consenting, not you as an individual. So if you have built a system that allows somebody to have more than one email address, you can only email them on the address that they've consented it for, not the other one. And that's what people expect. So if you start doing something different, you're going to have complaints about that. That's the first thing. Also, some people will choose to subscribe to your lists through both their work email and their personal email, because maybe sometimes they want to receive messages to both. And so you can't just choose to ignore one for whatever reason. It's important to follow that, because from their end, they'll just see it as it doesn't work. Finally, the biggest issue that people run around that is shared email addresses. There's a number of organizations that end up with shared email addresses. And by that, I mean you have two separate people who have transacted with you and who have used the same email address. There's any number of reasons why this could happen. If you're on the borderline between B2C and B2B, it's not uncommon for people to do something like put an email address that's accounts at their domain name, because they want the bill to go to the accounts team, but it might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people doing something. So when you start talking about the opt-in for that, it's like, well, which opt-in are you talking about? You've also got couples. A lot of couples, especially if they're older, will have a joint email address that they both use. And amongst younger couples, it's also not uncommon to have couples who have a third email address that is neither, one partner's or the other, but a shared one that's used for both. This is used for when you want both people to get the communications about something. It could be about your car insurance. It could be about the application that you've put in for your kid to go to a school. But there's two separate records potentially with the same email address. And so when it comes to managing that, if you have two people with the same email address and one of them unsubscribes, you really need to unsubscribe the other one as well. Because from their point of view, it's going to look like they unsubscribed and they kept getting the email. And that is the number one thing that we have found leads to customer complaints, where they say, your unsubscribe doesn't work. I pressed unsubscribed, I got another email, and I pressed unsubscribe again, and then I got another email yet again. And usually that happens because people have designed consent systems that are so complicated that people don't understand what they're opting in and out of, or organizations have made it too hard to opt out. And so as a result, people don't opt out in the way that the system designers envisioned it. And from the customer perspective, it looks like you are ignoring consent, and eventually they'll put in a complaint if they think that you're just not going to stop.
This is a really good example of how I guess customers feel when they have fragmented consent in your own systems. But maybe let's pivot slightly and talk about the cost of fragmentation. When consent data is spread across systems rather than maybe being duplicated in one, what tends to go wrong first in that scenario?
So it's super common to have people have multiple systems they use to message customers. For example, you might have a system that sends confirmations of appointments. You might have a system that sends automated comms from purchases. You may have a system that is used by staff on a retail floor that they use to message some others. And so when you go through that process, you end up in a situation where your consent is fragmented across multiple systems. And sorting that out can be quite complicated, because very often these different systems have a different view of what is and what isn't the same person. And so in the same way that we talked about email addresses being shared before, we also have to worry about phone numbers being shared and understanding what the consent is for and making sure that when someone has opted out, we do respect that opt-out and not further message the person on that channel. It can be complicated as well because as the system starts talking to each other, you need to stop them updating each other back and forth with the same information, but instead have what is the actual opt-in that the customer has provided. You need to be especially careful around that if you have any process that at any stage goes through a spreadsheet. And we've seen this a few times, especially with smaller customers or customers doing something that's out of the ordinary, where they will have something like a spreadsheet, which is based on a entry maybe at an event. They ran an event. People were able to, at the event, opt in to receive an email, and then they don't process that for 2 months. And suddenly, if you have somebody on that list who was already opted in before and has since opted out, you're actually processing a signal that is obsolete by the time you received it. And you are, from their point of view, it looks like you just ignore their choice, you just resubscribe them. And having that conversation is not a great one to have, right? It takes up a lot of time from the organizational point of view of, you have staff that are doing this. You'll often end up having technical people looking to see what's actually caused it. Is our system broken or not? And finally, from the customer perspective, they're just not going to trust you. So none of these things are good. And it's an example where having a tighter control over consent and a faster signal coming through would have avoided the problem in the first place.
Okay, so let's look for solutions here, I guess. That's a pretty ugly scenario that you're describing, and it's actually way more common than you think. Debatably not an edge case, debatably the majority, right? So in that case, if a team falls behind, where should they realistically start?
First thing is an audit, right? Understand, for my different systems, where do the rules differ about who is opted in and who is opted out? That's the first thing that we want to look at. The second thing that we want to look at is understanding where there is a difference, what's caused it in the first place. It could be that it's different because one system is used to collect consent, but is not used to update consent. So in my example before from the event, if you have a spreadsheet that is from an event, that is people who are consented to opt in, maybe they use one of those scanner things that you get at events where they scan your card and that counts as an opt-in. That spreadsheet is never going to update to be an opted out status because no one's opting out through the stand, especially after the events finish. So that is a point in time signal. Whereas for some of the other signals, it could be something that is updated as people go into their profile and make a change, or if they go and click on an email and unsubscribe, or maybe text unsubscribe back to an SMS that they've received. So when we look at all of these, understanding why do we have a difference between them and what's caused that to happen, and then starting to make decisions as to how we're going to equalize that. Personally speaking, I like to err on the side of, if you've unsubscribed for a channel on any of these places, then you're going to be counted as unsubscribed because that's a safe thing to do. And I would rather start from that point and have a conversation that flows from there rather than go the other way, because you need to be able to show why and how someone opted in. And if you have a discrepancy, that's going to be really hard to do. Whereas if you err on the side of caution, that problem goes away.
No, it's definitely, there's one thing that erring on the side of caution and, having an interesting approach to that with everything that you just said. I think it's also raises this flag that losing subscribers, maybe you could put it, or maybe eliminating people that consent is ambiguous is actually probably a good thing. But ultimately, one of the biggest things that I've noticed day to day is that it's actually okay if somebody unsubscribes, because there are a lot of benefits to it outside of just maybe having a cleaner database. But look, if someone listens to what we're talking about and walks away with a bit of a shift in how they think about consent, what should that be primarily?
Number one, figure out where the discrepancies are. That's really where you're going to start. The second one is making sure you understand how we talked about channel before for consent. Understand how the channel key is going to change. So does your system, for example, support somebody changing their phone number or their email address? Because as soon as you have that, you introduce an even bigger complicated set of problems, and you need to be really clear around what does it mean when that happens, so that you can actually control how these things are connected and see how they line up. The next step after that usually is to try and work out what's going to be my single source of truth for the consent flag. And ideally, can I make the other systems call out and go, hey, is email address abcd@example.com currently subscribed, yes or no? And if it is subscribed, what is it subscribed to?
That's some awesome takeaways there. Thank you so much for chatting through that today. And also, thanks for joining us. I know it's, again, not the most exciting topic in the world, but it makes all the difference to your subscribers, your customer experience, if you listen to them, and hopefully tailor the communications to them in the way that they would expect. If today's conversation raised some questions about consent, identity, or trust, we'd love to continue that conversation with you. So feel free to reach out to us at info@hmarketing.com.au or find us on LinkedIn. We'll see you next time.